All right, everybody, welcome back. We are moving on this week to Module 10, Energy, Nutrition, and Metabolism. So last week we were discussing the chemistry of life and really understanding the structure and the smallest compounds in biology and how those um, in turn come to create the cell structure and cell theory. And this week, we're going to sort of take that the next step further. We're starting to understand how energy drives and allows life to persist, and understand how the micronutrients, the micro and the molecules that we examined in our last lecture uh, come to create energy and actually to create um, cell structure and ultimately what powers life. So that's what we're going to be discussing this week. So in your book, uh, the first chapter that we're discussing this week looked at energy in terms of malnutrition. So I wanted to highlight the work of Dr. Kikafunda, who works in Uganda on malnutrition. And so not only was her work able to assess the different risk factors for malnutrition, she was also able to link how malnutrition influences the immune system and how a low immune system can lead to more malnutrition. And you get this vicious cycle of um, immunocompromised individuals becoming more and more malnourished in Uganda. And what we're going to be doing in this lecture is we're going to be understanding what causes malnutrition, not just a lack of food, but cellularly what is happening that causes malnutrition and why is it such a vicious state to combat in public health. So our driving questions for this lecture is going to be, what are macronutrients and micronutrients, and how are they provided by food? Secondly, what are essential nutrients, and what does that have to do and linked with malnutrition? Third, what are enzymes and how do they work? And this is going to give us the framework to understanding how biologically we derive energy. So in your chapter readings for this week, the question of malnutrition was viewed through the lens of the Peanut Butter Project, which is essentially a way of combating malnutrition with a protein-enriched peanut butter that contains several macronutrients that allow individuals with malnutrition to rapidly gain weight and obtain the nutrients that they need in order to recuperate. And this is led through by a nonprofit organization that's working to end malnutrition in Africa. So what specifically is malnutrition? It's a medical condition that is resulting from a lack of essential nutrients in the diet. And that's what we're going to be diving into, is what precisely are essential nutrients and why does our body need them? So this is often a condition that, but not always necessarily, associated with starvation, the lack of nutrients in food. So malnutrition is actually the #1 killer of children around the world. In fact, more children die of malnutrition than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. So it's really one of the most important what we call DALYs, or disability affected life years, that affect children around the world today. And when we look at where malnutrition tends to happen and where the highest deaths happen, we're looking particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have lots of conflict, and also we have high levels of poverty, and critically we have food scarcities for large portions of the year. And this is getting worse with climate change, And again, so we have this sort of vicious cycle of poverty, conflict, and climate-related factors that are influencing malnutrition rates around the world. But I want to bring us back to this critical question that we're going to be looking at in this lecture, and that's, why does a lack of food lead to malnutrition? And ultimately, it's because our food contains nutrients. But what do nutrients mean biologically? So nutrients are the chemical building blocks that our bodies need to live, grow, and repair themselves. And these nutrients are what gives our body energy, or gives our cells the ability to perform their basic functions. And energy is the ability to do work. It powers our activities, and it helps us build complex muscles that enable us to work and live. So when we're starting to talk about nutrients, there are two large groups that we tend to talk about. We talk about macronutrients and micronutrients. And we're going to start with macronutrients. So you've probably run across this term, if nothing else, through the internet or some diet culture site discussing how your body best maintains macronutrients. But those actually have a very specific biological definition. And macronutrients are really divided up into three main groups: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And at the and ultimately, nutrients are the what organisms need to ingest in order to maintain stasis, and in order to maintain the healthy bodily functions that we all need to survive. And again, these are broken up into these three primary compounds: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But what do those mean specifically? So I'm going to have you watch a great video as part of your quiz that dives into the chemical nature of each of these. So keep an eye out for that in your quiz. But these are the primary macronutrients that your body needs to survive. And food is what provides our macronutrients. So foods contain usually mixtures of macronutrients. And a varied diet has to include vegetables, oils, grains, meat, and dairy products. And this is just a image from myplate.gov, which was, as you probably recognize, Michelle Obama's health initiative of understanding the different types of foods and the amount that you should have in order to maintain and get those macronutrients. And most food have a variety of macronutrients in them. So for example, there are several, these are just looking at foods that are rich in carbohydrates, foods that are rich in proteins, and foods that are rich in fats. And you can see there's cross between a lot of these different categories. And again, different foods will have different densities of these different macronutrients. And a lot of foods will contain all three types of macronutrients. As you can see sort of in this sort of helpful diagram, you can see where there's overlap between these different types of macronutrients. And the proportion is going to vary in different foods. So there are some legumes, for example, that are very dense in carbohydrates and proteins compared to something like a fruit, which may have carbohydrates in them, but is not necessarily a dense carbohydrate. And generally speaking, animal products contain more protein per gram than a carbohydrate. Again, that's just an example of understanding that macronutrients can vary in the different types of foods that we consume. and again, another example is just like plant products contain more carbohydrates than protein. Again, these are just generalities, but the critical thing to take away from this is that macronutrients exist in different types of food, and they may have a larger proportion of these three macronutrients than other types of food. So, in conclusion, when we're talking about macronutrients, we're talking about large molecules. And what's important regarding macronutrients is that these are really what is providing our cells with the building blocks of that they need to be able to create and derive energy. And another thing that's important to keep in mind is that while we need to get macronutrients from food, they cannot be used directly from our diet. So there has to be a process of essentially packaging and breaking down these macronutrients so that they can be used by our cells. And these subunits are essentially these energy building blocks, and that's what our cells really use and are able to structurally utilize these macronutrients. And that's what we're going to be sort of picking up in our next lecture, where we're looking specifically at the process of digestion and looking at enzyme and how we break down these macronutrients so that our cells can use them. Okay, let's pick up in our next lecture in 10.2.